Okay, good morning, everybody. Hope you're well. Once again, it's a tribute both to the OU and to everybody who comes. That even on a fast day, we try to continue the Limud HaTorah. Baruch Hashem, it's still relatively early in the fast, so we're not yet, totally exhausted and the like. But Be'ezus Hashem, may it be a zechus, among other things, that we cover the various mitzvos, and more or less in a very approximate way, we've been tracking the parsha, and even today I'm going to track a little bit about Parshas Pinchas, but I want to digress a little bit to talk about the fast day, what the 17th of Tammuz is, and what the origin of the 17th of Tammuz is. So one has to know that the concept of a fast in the month of Tammuz, although not the specific date, already appears in Nevi'im. The last Navi, or among the last Nevi'im, like Chagai, Zechariah, Malachi, are the last prophets at the very beginning of the Second Temple, after the 70 years of the Babylonian exile. And the Navi Zechariah speaks about 4 fast days that he identifies by the month, counting from Nisan as the first month. He talks about Tzom HaRavi'i, the fast of the 4th month, Nisan, Iyar, Sivan, Tammuz, the fast of Tammuz. Tzom HaChamishi, the fast of the 5th month, which is Av. Tzom HaShavi'i, the fast of the 7th month, which is not referring to Yom Kippur, that's in the Torah, but it's referring to the fast of Gedalia. And Tzom HaAsiri, the fast of the 10th month, which happens to be Teves. So the Navi tells us that even though these are fast days, they shall become days of Sason and Simcha. So the Navi is not telling you to fast, it's the other way around. The Navi is presupposing that people are aware of these fast days, and is simply telling us these fast days shall be nisapech to Sason v'Simcha. But since the Navi is telling us that these are fast days, so therefore these fast days are considered to be a little bit more chamor. They are considered to be somot midivrei Kabbalah. The phrase divrei Kabbalah in Chazal does not mean mysticism or Zohar or anything, but Kabbalah means a received tradition from the prophets. Now it's interesting. From the standpoint of pure halacha, divrei Kabbalah just equals midrabanan, meaning to say there's no such thing as a doraisa other than the mitzvos that Moshe Rabbeinu got from God. So even things that are communicated by the prophets are technically rabbinic fast days. They are not Torah fast days. And indeed, the prophets could not even institute this by prophecy. This is the famous law based on Lo Bashamayim, the Torah is not in heaven. And Ein Hanavi Rishai Lechadesh Bodavar, a prophet cannot innovate a halacha based on prophecy. So if the Nevi'im talk about a certain practice, they are either recording something that's in the Torah, obviously the Navi talks about Shabbos and Kashrus, or the Navi as a Chacham is enacting takanot. So halachically, these fast days are considered to be midrabanan, although they have a little bit more of a higher status because it's rabbanan from the Nevi'im, but halachically, divrei Kabbalah is actually no different than a pure midrabanan. There is another reference, very indirect and oblique, and not very clear, to these fast days, and that is the end of Megillas Esther, which also occurs in the tail end. In fact, this is actually before Zechariah, in the tail end of the 70 years of the Babylonian exile, when it talks about how the Jewish people accepted upon themselves the holiday of Purim. Kasher kimu al atzmam, as they accepted upon themselves divrei hatzomos, the fast days, v'zak hasam, and the prayers. And the Meforshim say this is not referring to Tanis Esther, because that was a much later fast that is even post-Talmudic. but rather it's simply saying the same way they accepted the 4 fast days connected to the Churban, they accepted upon themselves the holiday of Purim. So it doesn't tell you the 4, and it doesn't tell you where the 4 are, but the Meforshim say that Divrei Hatzomot V'Zakatam is a reference to the 4 fast days that are enumerated in the pasuk in Zechariah. Now, the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah makes a very, very interesting point. The Gemara in Rosh Hashanah says, on one hand, these are fast days. On the other hand, they are described as Yemei Sason V'Simcha. How do you reconcile the disconnect? So the Gemara says there are 3 stages in the halachic status of these fast days. He says, when there is shalom, a term to be defined in a moment, they become sason and simcha. Not only are there's no obligation to fast, you are prohibited to fast. These are holidays. Tisha B'Av will be a holiday. Says, when it is a time of active persecution against the Jewish people are being persecuted by enemies, then you are mechuyev to fast, midivrei Kabbalah. But then there's an intermediate stage. It's not a time of great prosperity and peace, but it's not a time of active persecution. So the Gemara says an interesting thing. It depends on what each community does. Ratzu. If a community, now there's not an individual person, it's not that each person decides, but if a community decides they want to observe the fast, misanin, then they become obligated to observe their minhag. Loi ratzu, if the community does not decide to fast, ein misanin, they're not mechuyev. So we have 3 categories. In the Zman of Shalom, it is a holiday. In the time of persecution against Jews, there is a chiyuv midivrei Kabbalah to fast. When there is neither persecution nor particular prosperity, which I'll describe that in a moment, then it is taloi on ratzu or lo ratzu, communal acceptance. Now, obviously, these terms need a lot of definition, and the way Rashi defines the terms is that shalom means you actually have a Beis HaMikdash, and the Jewish people are not at war with their enemies. So according to Rashi, that is called a Zman of Shalom, and at that point they become Yomim Tovim, which would indicate at least for some of the Second Temple period, there was no obligation to observe those fast days of the first Churban. So Shmad is the other way, that's when there's active persecution. So it's interesting, if we ask ourselves, how do we characterize Zaman Hazeh? So Zaman Hazeh is clearly not Shalom, because we don't have a Beis HaMikdash. So the question becomes, these days are not Yomim Tovim yet, that's for sure. The question becomes, are they obligatory fast days? Or are they only based on communal acceptance? So many Meforshim say, in places where Jews are not actively persecuted, the chiyuv of the fast days, although I mentioned Tisha B'Av might be different, is only mitam minhag and acceptance of the community. Now, the interesting question becomes, well, what does that mean? What if my community, or the United States, let's say, more or less, even though things happening, more or less, we would not call that a place of active persecution. You may differ with me, but generally speaking. On the other hand, there are places in the world where Jews are persecuted. So does that mean if Jews are being persecuted anywhere, it becomes a Shas Hashmad everywhere? Or is it literally community by community? But I just want to explain that this is why there are many leniencies in these fast days, except for Tisha B'Av, which I'll get to, simply because the status of the fast day today is only based on communal acceptance. It is not based on the chiyuv midivrei Kabbalah, and as a result, there are leniencies. Meaning to say, at a time like the Holocaust, it could very well be there was a chiyuv midivrei Kabbalah to fast, and maybe some of the leniencies for not feeling well and the like might not apply. Lamaisa, you'll find that there are kehilos in which women are routinely told, supposedly women are weaker, although I don't see that, but they're routinely told not to fast. I am told there are certain yeshivos where the students are told not to fast, except for Tisha B'Av. I'll get to why Tisha B'Av is different, because it's only a minhag, therefore you could be makel for any type of weakness or the like. But the point I want to make is the halachic basis of the kulos is only because we treat ourselves as a category 3, ratzu misanin, ratzu einen misanin. Meaning if you would be in a shas hashmad, the chiyuv or shas of persecution against Jews, the chiyuv of fasting would be me'ikar adin. So that does raise an interesting halachic question, which I don't think anybody has addressed that I'm aware of. That is, right now, we're in a time of war. So it's interesting, if we are in an active time of war, would that make the Tanesa midivrei Kabbalah? Now again, I have absolutely seen no one address this, but here's the nafkamina. Last year, if somebody would say, oh, they have a headache, we would kind of say, okay, you can eat, you have a headache. But that's only because it's a ratzu, low ratzu situation. So if somebody were to ask me this year, they have a headache, although I can guarantee you a posek is going to say the same thing as he said last year. And in fact, I have said the same thing I said last year. But analytically, I wonder if that's emes. Because the halachic basis for leniency is because of the ratzu and the loy ratzu, meaning once the fast gets upgraded to divrei Kabbalah, at that point, the leniencies might not apply. You see? So, I don't know. I actually think that the logic of what I'm saying is a very, very strong logic, but I hasten to add that the derech of psak has not changed, meaning to say the same leniencies that will normally be given any 17th of Tammuz will be given here as well, although I think we could question it. Now, the Gemara then says, Tisha B'Av is different. Tisha B'Av, the actual day of the Churban Beis HaMikdash, there is a chiyuv midivrei Kabbalah to fast. Now, there's a machlokas how to learn. Some understand it this way, that the difference between Tisha B'Av and the other fast days only pertains to the neutral situation, where there's not shalom and there's not persecution. Tisha B'Av is still a chiyuv midivrei Kabbalah, which is why the leniencies that we might apply to the other fast days, we're not going to apply to Tisha B'Av. But when it's a time of shalom, you have the Beis HaMikdash, then even Tisha B'Av would be a day of sason v'simcha. That's how some learn. Others learn, which means, in other words, they did not observe the fast of the 9th of Av during the 420 years of the Second Temple, at least until the Romans started waging war. On the other hand, the Rambam in Perush HaMishnayos actually says that they observed the fast of the 9th of Av even during the 420 years of the second Beis HaMikdash. That when the Gemara says Tisha B'Av is a Yotzei Min HaKlal, it does not only refer to the neutral Ratzu and Lo Ratzu, it even refers to a Shas Shalom, although I believe even the Rambam is Moda, that when Mashiach comes and we have a third Beis HaMikdash, we're not going to keep Tisha B'Av as a fast. But the Rambam is not talking about that, but the Rambam is talking about the Bayit Sheni. And the question would be very obvious. Why would we fast over the destruction of the first Beis HaMikdash when we have a Beis HaMikdash? Why are you misabel over the Churban Beis HaMikdash when you have a Beis HaMikdash? So there are two reasons that would apply. Reason number one is that the second Beis Hamikdash never fully replaced what we lost in the first Beis Hamikdash. In the first Beis Hamikdash, we had Nevuah that more or less went away at the beginning of the second temple. We had the Urim V'Tumim, which was, again, the Kohen Gadol's breastplate, which communicated divine messages. Now, in the second Beis Hamikdash, we had the Choshen. People confuse the Choshen with the Urim V'Tumim. Let me just digress for a moment. The Choshen is the breastplate that the Kohen Gadol wore that had engraved on 12 jewels the tribes of Bnei Yisrael. That is not the Urim V'Tumim. That is called the Choshen, and the jewels are called the Avnei HaChoshen. When we say we didn't have the Urim V'Tumim, we did have the Choshen. The Kohen Gadol did have the Choshen. In fact, that's the famous story of a jewel was lost, and they had to buy it from a non-Jew who didn't want to wake up his father, Dama ben Nesina. That happened during the Second Temple period. By the way, that story itself is very interesting. The Gemara uses Dama ben Nesina, a non-Jew from Ashkelon, to illustrate how the greatness of Kibbutz Aviyim, and it mentions he didn't wake up his father, even though he lost a big deal with selling the jewel, because the key to the jewelry case was under his father's pillow. He didn't want to wake up his father, and his reward was that next year he got a para aduma, and he was able to sell it for the profit that he would have made. Okay, now let me ask you this. Let's imagine your father is sleeping, and you're offered $10 million. A deal, but you need to retrieve something under your father's pillow. You don't wake him up. You follow Dama ben Nesina. Dad wakes up, and you say, Dad, I want to tell you how much I honored you. I gave up a $10 million deal. Isn't that great? Well, I think Dad would be a little annoyed. Dad would say, what type of idiot did I raise? Of course you wake me up. I mean, halachically, it's absolutely clear. I mean, a simple example. If your father would tell you to wake him up, you should wake him up. If you know for sure he would want to be woken up for this type of deal, of course you wake him up. So Dama ben Nesina actually did a stupid thing. So the Gemara is not quoting him to show what you're supposed to do. The Gemara is just quoting how devoted he was to the mitzvah. It happened to be misplaced. His particular application was not correct, and we're not quoting it to tell you what you should do if you're faced with that situation, but it shows us his heart. It shows us that he was willing to give up all of that money, and therefore it's a musar as to how seriously we should take Kibbutz Aviyim. This is an important point to keep in mind, that sometimes when the Gemara gives you a story, there are other examples of this as well, it's not necessarily telling you what you should do, but it's communicating a certain attitude that you should have, even though the particulars are not something you should do. Okay, but be it as it may, that shows us that the breastplate and the jewels did exist during the Bayit Sheni, but what happened was the Urim V'Tumim was a piece of parchment that it was like a software package, that had the names of God on it, and it would be inserted in the folds of the breastplate, and that would give the jewels the power to communicate prophetic messages from God. So since we lost prophecy, we lost the Urim V'Tumim. So the second Beis Hamikdash, we didn't have Nevuah for most of the period. We didn't have the Urim V'Tumim. We didn't even have the Aron HaKodesh with the Luchos. Because before the Chorban by the hands of the Babylonians, Yoshio HaMelech, one of the last righteous kings, concealed the Aron HaKodesh in tunnels under the Beis HaMikdash, where we believe it's still there. Right? Raiders of the Lost Ark notwithstanding, there is a concept. In fact, occasionally there are expeditions trying to find it, although it wouldn't. Here I would refer you to Raiders of the Lost Ark. It's not a good idea, and the like. In fact, somebody came to the Chafetz Chaim with kind of a detailed plan to find where the Aron is. And the Chafetz Chaim took the paper, he read it, he burnt it, and he made the person swear that he would not talk about it to anybody. So different thing. So the point I'm making is, going back to the Rambam. The Rambam says what? They fasted on the 9th of Av, midivrei Kabbalah, even when there was a second Beis HaMikdash. And you may ask, what's the logic of that? Because even in the second Beis HaMikdash, we didn't regain what we lost. In the first Beis HaMikdash, we were still mourning over it. In addition to the fact that other than around 100 years of the Hasmonean monarchy, the whole period of the Bayit Sheni, we did not have any independence. Meaning, unlike the first Beis HaMikdash, where there was Malchus Yehuda, Malchei Beis David, the whole second temple period, the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, 100 years of Malchus Chashmonai, but Chazal look at that as a continuation of the Greek monarchy. They don't even consider it to be such a Jewish monarchy. So that's reason number one why they fasted in the second Beis HaMikdash over the loss of the first Beis HaMikdash. Reason number two is actually given by Rav Soloveitchik, Rav Yosef Dov Soloveitchik. Very interesting. He says that it was known that the second Beis HaMikdash was not going to last. It was known it was going to be destroyed. And it was known it would be destroyed on the 9th of Av, the same day as the first Beis HaMikdash. But they didn't know when. So Rav Soloveitchik suggests every single 9th of Av, there was a great fear and trepidation that this might be the day of the Chorban. So he points out, therefore, there was a difference between the way Tisha B'Av was observed during the 70 years of the Babylonian exile and today as well, and the way it was observed during the Second Temple period. During the 70 years of Chorban and today, Tisha B'Av is Avelos. We are mourning something we lost. Rav Soloveitchik suggests that during the Second Temple period, it was not Avelos, it was praying that the TORAH of the Chorban should not come, meaning that the other shoe should not drop. So the first explanation I gave you actually shows there was an Avelos even in the second Beis HaMikdash. The second explanation says that the fast of Av was not based on Avelos, it was based on fasting that a tzara should not happen. The tzara of the Chorban Sheni, which they knew was going to happen, and they knew it would be on the 9th of Av, but they didn't know when. Although I'm not sure why they didn't know when, because the book of Daniel actually foretells that it would be 490 years after the Chorban Bayis Rishon, but whatever it is, that requires a certain amount of interpretation, and many people did not have that level of knowledge or interpretation. Okay, so the reason why we are more machmer, again, so technically, the reason why Tisha B'Av is a more chomor fast than the other fast days is because the other fast days, Bisman Hazeh, if there's not active persecution, are only mitam minag, ratzu, lo ratzu. Tisha B'Av is midivrei Kabbalah. Certainly today, the Rambam says even during the second Mikdash, certainly today, there's no ratzu or lo ratzu about Tisha B'Av, and that is the Halachic categorization of why the 9th of Av is more chomer. Now, when we look specifically at the fast of the 17th of Tammuz, the Mishnah in Maseches Tainis tells us 5 tragedies happened on the 17th of Tammuz, and 5 tragedies happened on the 9th of Av, and that is why these days are days of fasting. Let me first mention the Tisha B'Av ones, although we're not there yet because they're actually easier to follow. Tragedy number 1 of Tisha B'Av, it is the day that it was decreed that our forefathers would die in the desert over 40 years and not enter the land, because the Meraglim came back on the 8th of Av, and they gave their negative reports. And that night, which was the 9th of Av, the Jewish people, the men, not the women. The women had emunah in Hashem, but the men cried and sobbed and complained. And Hashem said, you have made this, you have cried for no reason. Bechia shel chinam. This is the day of Bechia l'dorot. Right, so that's tragedy number one. The Gezerah that the Dor HaMidbar died without coming into Eretz Yisrael. Gezerah number two is the destruction of the first Beis HaMikdash by the Babylonians. Gezerah number three is the destruction of the second Beis HaMikdash 490 years later on the same day by the Romans in the year 70. Gezerah number four is the destruction of Beitar. And this is already a reference to the Bar Kokhba revolt. Remember, the temple was destroyed more or less in the year 70. Again, it's still, in Chazal, it's not clear if it's 68, 70 if you translate the dates, but let's use 70, that's the common date that is given. And around 65, now it's interesting, after the Chorban Beis HaMikdash, even though we call that the Gullus, but many Jews were killed and many Jews were taken prisoner and sold into slavery, but it's not like the Babylonian exile. When Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the Beis HaMikdash, he literally emptied out the country. The Romans didn't. Jews continued to live in Eretz Yisrael after the Churban. Many of them migrated from Yerushalayim, which had become a war zone, to the Galil. The Sanhedrin, for example, relocated to the Galil. Jewish life continued in Eretz Yisrael even after the Churban, in spite of the devastating tragedies and loss of life. I'm not minimizing that in any way, but Jews continued to live in Eretz Yisrael and created kehilos. And not only that, but the post-Churban years did not really have anti-religious legislation. The Romans didn't care about Shabbos and Kashrus and Torah and circumcision. Do what you want. They destroyed the Beis HaMikdash in order to squash the rebellion of the Zealots against Roman authority. And as we know, our own Chachamim were very much against that revolutionary activity. And the Chachamim warned that if you do this, the Beis HaMikdash is going to be destroyed. So the Chorban Beis HaMikdash was not, I know this is a little different than the way it's commonly conveyed, was not an anti-religious act per se. It was really an attempt to crush a political revolt, and the Chachamim warned that this would be the consequence of that revolt. However, 65 years later, we have a second revolt, the Bar Kokhba revolt. Shimon ben Kuziva, that Rabbi Akiva believed was Mashiach potentially, and he called him Bar Kokhba, the son of a star, waged war against the Romans, and initially he was extremely successful. He liberated some 900 villages. He minted the Bar Kokhba coins that you can get. Rabbi Akiva thought he was Mashiach. And maybe we'll talk for another time. Was Rabbi Akiva wrong, or potentially could he have been Mashiach? It's a very, very interesting question. There is archaeological evidence that the foundations for a third Beis HaMikdash were laid under the guidance of Rabbi Akiva on the Temple Mount. So things looked very, very good. But then Hadrian, Adrianus Caesar, retaliated with overwhelming, devastating force. And Custer's last stand, so to speak, was in Beitar, where Bar Kokhba's armies were decimated. The rebellion was crushed. And I want to point out, all of the anti-religious things of the Romans, Rabbi Akiva's flesh gets combed with iron combs, that is the aftermath of Bar Kokhba, not the aftermath of the Churban. And that's when Hadrian passed laws about Brit Milah and about Torah learning, because he was so determined. Of course, we know that he did not let the corpses of Harugei Beitar be buried for 3 years. Miraculously, they didn't decompose, and eventually he let them get buried on the 15th of Av, 3 years and a week after the fall of Beitar. So Beitar was absolutely catastrophic. The numbers the Gemara gives for those who died in Beitar are so astronomical. I mean, tens of millions that even the Maharal says these are understood as guzma. They're not meant to be taken literally, but there's no question the casualties were much, much greater than even the Churban Beis Hamikdash, and the religious persecution was much greater than the Churban Beis Hamikdash. And Jews were not allowed to live in Yerushalayim for over 200 years. It became, Hadrian dedicated the whole city of Jerusalem as a temple or a shrine to Jupiter, and that's Aelia Capitolina, and the remnant of that Roman city is found in the Cardo, in the old cities. Now Cardo is a shopping mall, something, whatever it is, but kind of that's the new Avodah Zarah, right? The Cardo used to be the shrine to Jupiter. Now it's the shrine to consumerism. So I'm not sure if we advanced that much, but okay, that's the new Avodah Zarah of our time. So be it as it may, we'll talk later about this in more length. The destruction of Beitar was on the 9th of Av. Right? So we have the Chet HaMeraglim, Chorban Bayis Rishon, Chorban Bayis Sheni, Beitar, 135, 65 years after the Chorban, and the like. And the final tragedy, which is really connected to the aftermath of Beitar. So it's going in chronological order. The five tragedies are a straight chronological line, is Nechresh Ha'ir. The city of Yerushalayim was plowed over with salt to destroy its fertility. This actually was a common practice in Roman conquests. They did this a lot. It was not even unique to Yerushalayim. They did it in other countries as well. But this too happened, not the same Tisha B'Av, but shortly, I don't know if it was the next year or 2 years, whatever it was, but shortly after the fall of Beitar, Yerushalayim was plowed over, Nechresha Ha'ir. Now there is a bit of a machlokas. I actually took a position here, but it is a machlokas. Some say Nechresha Ha'ir is plowing the city with salt, destroying its fertility. Others say it refers to a kind of surveying thing, that when the Romans took over a territory and dedicated it as a temple, they would plow the boundaries to kind of demarcate this as their square. So Nechresh Ha'ir, according to this interpretation, is not referring to plowing the whole city, but it means plowing the boundary lines. So this was a Judenrein place. For 200 years, Jews were not allowed to live in Yerushalayim at all. They were not allowed to live in this. Now maybe people snuck in, I don't know. You never know. I mean, I know a guy who actually visited the Kotel between 48 and 67 under fake passports and everything else, and he was quite literally putting his life in the line. So people sneak in and people do all sorts of things. In fact, another person told me, this person loves adventure. Sometimes he just seeks out adventure. That he came with a baseball cap. Somehow he got into an Arab country when Israeli passports were not recognized at all, and he's like having a Coca-Cola or a coffee with an Arab. And the Arab is just talking about, when I see it, he's like peeling an apple or something with a knife. And he says, when I see a Jew, all I want to do is like take my knife and, cut off his whatever. Says, what do you think about that? and the guy had this real feeling that this Arab knew, somehow, So there are people who love to play dangerously, live dangerously. So who knows what happened? But for 200 years, no Yidden came to Yerushalayim. The only thing the Romans allowed was to rub salt in our wounds, literally. Every 9th of Av, Jews were able to come and they could walk around the perimeter of the city. And to this day, there is an old minhag of Yerushalayim that some people follow even today, that you walk around the walls of Yerushalayim on the 9th of Av. And that is an ancient custom. That dates from after the fall of Beitar. That was the one connection Jews were allowed to have. I mean, obviously the Romans were mocking us, but the Jews were allowed to have in Yerushalayim. So whether it's on ground level or on top of the wall, whatever, this is actually an old minhag that dates back and the like. These are certain minhagim that are not always recorded. The other familiar minhag, that Jews do not walk under the Arch of Titus in Rome. The Arch of Titus is the triumphal arch that commemorates, quite literally, the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash. Judea captiva, right? Judea has been captive, and it shows the Jews in chains. The menorah, it's interesting that the picture of Titus's menorah is a kasha on the Rambam. It's an interesting question. How reliable do you look at the Arch of Titus? The Rambam has a shita that the menorah, like Chabad menorah, if you look at the Chabad menorahs and the like, it comes out like in diagonal lines. It's not rounded. And that is actually a diagram of the Rambam himself. The Rambam, for whatever his raya was, the Rambam maintained that the menorah was not rounded. It was a straight diagonal coming out of the central shaft. The question is that the Rambam's shita directly contradicts the Arch of Titus, that indeed gives you the picture that we're familiar with of the rounded menorah. So the question is, okay, who says the Arch of Titus has ne'emanut? On the other hand, it's not clear to me why they would lie. I mean, it's not a question of ne'emanut. I mean, why would they make up? So I'll leave that for another time. But these are the 5 tragedies of the 9th of Av. So now let's go backwards a little bit, and let's look at the 5 tragedies of the 17th of Tammuz, which are actually a bit more obscure. The first tragedy is relatively clear. That was the day that Moshe Rabbeinu broke the luchos when he saw the Chet HaEgel coming down from Har Sinai. And the Gemara in Tainus, makes the cheshbon that from the 6th of Sivan, when he went up, and he came down on the 40th day. So the Gemara makes a cheshbon that was the 17th of Tammuz. Nishtabru haluchos. The luchos were smashed. Of course, one could ask, even this, which is the dating is not a question, but still, given the fact that we got the second luchos and on Yom Kippur, why would it be that we're still in Avelut over the Chet HaEgel? But the answer is that Chazal tell us that the sin of the golden calf continues to be a source of persecution for us. Every single onish Klal Yisrael gets, there's a little bit of payment for the Chet HaEgel. I should remark too, interestingly enough, that 17th of Tammuz happens to be the yahrzeit of my Rebbe, my Rosh Hashiva, Rav Shmuel Yaakov Weinberg, Rav Noach Weinberg's older brother. And indeed, as was remarked when he was nifter, that's also Nishtabru haluchos, when a great gadol, great Talmid Chacham dies. It's like the luchos of the Torah are smashed. So that's the first tragedy. Okay. Now, the second and third tragedies are a little less clear. One is Hufka'a ha'ir, the city was breached, or the city was broken into. And the third is Batel hatamid, the daily offering that is brought in the morning and in the afternoon was discontinued. So I want to look at these two together and raise the question, are these interrelated events or are these two separate things? Now, Hufka Ha'ir, what is that referring to? First temple or second temple? So the Gemara in Maseches Tainus asks the following. In the book of Yirmiyahu, it actually tells us that the Babylonians began their siege around Jerusalem. Nebuchadnezzar, under his general Nebuzaradan, Nebuchadnezzar was not in Eretz Yisrael, but his general did it, on the 10th of Teves. That's why the 10th of Teves is the beginning of the siege against Jerusalem. That siege lasted for more than 3 years. But in Tammuz, the Babylonian army managed to break through the city wall. So Hufka Ha'ir, the Babylonians broke through the city wall, culminating in the destruction of the temple 3 weeks later. But here's the problem. In the book of Yirmiyahu, the date that is given for Nebuchadnezzar's army breaking through the walls is the 9th of Tammuz, not the 17th of Tammuz. So how can we say the 17th of Tammuz is Hufka Ha'ir? Hufka Ha'ir is the 9th of Tammuz. So there's a machlokes, the Bavli and the Yerushalmi, how to resolve this contradiction. The Babylonian Talmud says there is a difference between the first Beis HaMikdash and the second Beis HaMikdash. In the first Beis HaMikdash, the Babylonians broke through the wall on the 9th of Tammuz. In the second Beis HaMikdash, Vespasian's army, he was not emperor yet, broke through the wall on the 17th of Tammuz. So, in reality, we ought to fast both on the 9th of Tammuz and on the 17th of Tammuz, but the Chachamim didn't want to give us two fasts so close to each other, although I don't know why. Tzom Gedalia is close to Yom Kippur, but be it as it may, they didn't want to make two fast days for Hufka Ha'ir, and therefore they went with the second Mikdash because that is the tragedy we are most connected to, because that is the relatively more recent one. So, according to the Bavli, therefore, Hufka Ha'ir by the Bayit Rishon was the 9th of Tammuz. Hufka Ha'ir by the Bayit Sheni was the 17th of Tammuz. So we fast on the 17th of Tammuz, even though we think about both tragedies. Interestingly enough, I have to say, there is no day for the second Mikdash that corresponds to Asar B'Teves. And I don't know why. Asar B'Teves is the beginning of the Babylonian siege of the city. And we have a fast day for that. What is the day of the beginning of the Roman siege of Yerushalayim? I happen not to know. I could probably find it in Josephus or something. But the one thing I do know is there is no fast day commemorating the beginning of the Roman siege. And that siege was awful. There was massive famine. I mean, and we have Kinos, the book of Yirmiyahu. That siege was a devastating siege. And it also lasted several years, like the Babylonian siege. So I leave it as a question, why is there no Asara B'Teves analog for the beginning of the siege against Yerushalayim by the Bayit Sheni? But be it as it may, the Bavli understands Hufka Ha'ir B'Rishayna is the 9th of Tammuz. Hufka Ha'ir B'Shniya is 17th. That's the Bavli. The Talmud Yerushalmi says a whole other pshat. Oh yes, I just want to go back. I want to point out that means actually the amount of time between Hufka Ha'ir and Churban Beis HaMikdash. In the Bayis Rishon was a whole month, the 9th of Tammuz to the 9th of Av. In the Bayis Sheni, it was 3 weeks, between the 17th of Tammuz and the 9th of Av. So according to the Bavli, the time between Hufka Ha'ir and Churban Bayis Rishon was a month, not 21 days. The Talmud Yerushalmi gives another answer to the contradiction. The Talmud Yerushalmi actually says, Kilkul Cheshbainis Hayukan. This is hard to understand, but in the deep grief over the Churban, even the prophets became discombobulated, and they just got their dates wrong. Meaning, in both the first temple and the second temple, Hufka Ha'ir was the 17th of Tammuz. Why is it recorded the 9th of Tammuz? Because in the aftermath of the Churban, people were so confused that they kind of said, 9th of Av, 9th of Tammuz. Kilkul Cheshbainis. Now people ask me, well, what are you talking about? Yirmiyahu is a Navi of God. He's writing down his prophecies from God. So he writes down a wrong date? I mean, it's coming from Hashem. Hashem didn't get mixed up. The answer is, I think Hashem wanted us to understand how devastatingly mixed up people were. So he specifically didn't get, when he's dictating to Yirmiyahu, he kind of shuts off the prophecy valve when it comes to the dates. Yirmiyahu puts in the date that he remembered, which was the wrong date. Now that actually means, therefore, that even the first Beis HaMikdash was a period of 3 weeks between Hufka Ha'ir and Chorban Beis HaMikdash. 3 weeks. He thought it was a month, but it was 3 weeks. So this is a machlokas Bavli and Yerushalmi, just to be aware of. Kilkul Cheshbainas, Kasuf Khan. So we then come to the next one. The Korban Tamid was discontinued. The simplest explanation, and this is the one that I think most people assume, but it may not be the correct explanation, is that this simply means from the time Yerushalayim was broken into, even though the temple was not destroyed for another 3 weeks, the Korban Tamid could no longer be brought. Conditions were so difficult. The enemy is in the city, etc. Which means, in other words, Batal HaTamid is for a 3-week period, meaning the Korban Tamid stopped 3 weeks before the Korban, and that was a consequence of Hufka'a Ha'ir. In other words, you connect it. Once the Babylonians, well, that's another question. Is that referring to the Bayis Rishon Bichlal? Some say it's only the Bayis Sheni. But once the Romans, at least, entered the city, the Korban Tamid could no longer be brought. A shortage of animals. Now that doesn't mean, by the way, even that's a question, that there was total cessation. When it says Batel HaTamid, that does not have to mean that the Tamid was totally discontinued, but it means it's Tamidut. Tamidut was discontinued, meaning to say there were days they couldn't bring it. Meaning in the 21 days, maybe they brought it, 10 days, 15 days. Meaning if you don't bring it every day, that's called Batel HaTamid. The Tamidiyut of the Korban was nullified. So according to this, which I think is the normal interpretation that most people assume, Batal HaTamid is referring to the last 3 weeks between Hufka Ha'ir and Chorban Beis HaMikdash. So they go together. Hufka Ha'ir, Batel HaTamid. In fact, however, Rashi, in a bit of uncommon place in the book of Daniel, Rashi in Sefer Daniel actually learns very, very differently. And Rashi seems to understand Batel HaTamid is referring to the Bayit Sheni, not the Bayit Rishon. And in the prophecies of Daniel, actually they're technically not prophecies because he was not commanded to communicate them, but in the visions of Daniel, there is a vision about the destruction of the second Beis HaMikdash. Daniel already experienced the Chorban Bayis Sheni. And it mentions that the oppressor, which is Rome, Yashbitz, shall stop Zevach u'mincha, the animal offerings and the meal offerings, Chatzi Shavua, for half a week. For half a week, he shall stop Zevach u'mincha. Rashi explains in the book of Daniel that Shavua does not mean 7 days, but Shavua means 7 years. And therefore a Chatzi Shavua, would be 3.5 years. But Rashi then says, and Chatzi doesn't mean an exact half either. And Rashi records a tradition that during the Roman siege, which lasted several years, the Tamid was discontinued 3 years before the Chorban. Not 3 weeks before the Chorban, 3 years before the Korban. And even though 3 years is less than half of 7, but it's approaching that, and therefore you divide something in half even if they're not equal. Now here too, Rashi certainly does not mean that for the last 3 years of the last 3 years of the Beis Hamikdash, they didn't bring the korbanos. They brought korbanos all the way to the end, but it means they could no longer depend on it on a daily basis. The Tamid became not Tamid after that point. Indeed, Josephus records that even after the Romans entered the city, korbanos were still being brought. And he describes Kohanim bringing korbanos when arrows are going over their head. In fact, he even describes rival Jewish factions were fighting each other with arrows going back and forth, and the Kohanim dodging. In fact, he quotes Titus. Now again, Josephus is not always a reliable witness because Titus was his protector and the like. But Josephus says, he quotes Titus as saying, I don't really have to destroy this city. If I just wait long enough, the Jews will do it themselves. Now granted, Josephus's accounting of anything is not 100% reliable, but this actually has the ring of truth, because remember, Chazal did say that the second Beis Hamikdash was destroyed because of Sinat Chinam. So Josephus portraying the warring factions in the city makes perfect sense. Kind of like the Democratic Party now. Yeah.
What about the story that the animal had to be brought from outside the walls, and one day they put the pig in?
Yeah, so now I'm going to mention another thing. Okay, so far I gave you 2 different explanations about Batel HaTamid. One is the discontinuation of the Korban Tamid, at least on a daily basis, once the city was breached, which would just mean the last 3 weeks. The other is Rashi's interpretation, that which seems to be only the Bayit Sheni. Bayit Rishon, we don't have any teaching like that as a result of the Roman siege, even before they broke into the city, 3 years before the Korban, meaning the 17th of Tammuz, 3 years and 3 weeks. 3 years and 3 weeks before the Korban, the Tamid could no longer be relied upon. That's Rashi in Sefer Daniel. And then there's a third story about Bitul HaTamid that is way, 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 way before. More than 100 years before the Korban. And this is the waning years of the Hasmonean dynasty. A Jewish dynasty, a Jewish Malchus, in which 2 brothers were vying for control. Hyrcanus and Aristobulus. And Hyrcanus is in control of Yerushalayim. Aristobulus, this is mamash a civil war. Aristobulus is trying to gain control. And he put Jerusalem under siege. Again, this is not the Romans. This is a Jewish fighter. And there was still a deal that every day they would lower some coins in a basket, and the other side would still provide animals, sheep, that they could take up and bring as a korban. Meaning, even though we're fighting each other, but we want there to be korbanos in the Beis Hamikdash. That itself is interesting. And one time, in an act of derision, they put a pig in the basket, and it mentions how the pig clawed the walls and emitted a squeak that could be heard. The Chazal say it could be heard for 400 parsos, meaning it was such a bizayon, such a shame. So according to that, let me just explain something. According to that, Batel HaTamid was actually a one-time event. It doesn't mean, like you always say, the Korban Tamid was no longer brought. This is 100 years before the Korban. But it means on that day the Tamid was not brought. And this was such a shameful, degrading way of blaspheming God that it's memorialized in infamy. So he says, it's an interesting point. Batel HaTamid does not mean any type of permanent discontinuation. It's a commemoration of that event. Now let me just point out that There's a lot here that Chazal are concealing with this, because basically what Aristobulus did was he enlisted in his civil war against Hyrcanus the help of a Roman general who was nearby, whose name was Pompey, and he invited the Roman troops to help him out in what he thought would be a friendly mission. A mercenary type of thing. Pay them and then they'll get out. Pompey actually used this as a basis to add Palestine to the Roman Empire. So the conquest, so to speak, of Rome, of Eretz Yisrael, occurred through the invitation of Aristobulus. This was around the year 63 BCE. So again, just to remember this there, but the Romans got a foothold in Eretz Yisrael 63 BCE through Pompey, and what then happened was the Churban was the year 70 Common Era. So you're talking about 63 years plus 70 years, whatever that is. What does that add up to? 133. So the Roman domination of Eretz, well, actually, the Romans dominated us afterwards, but from the Churban, from the Roman entry to the Churban is 133 years. Okay? So that is the idea of, so we have three explanations of Batal HaTamid. One is it's referring to the last 3 weeks. The other is the last 3 years. And the third is it's a one-time event that's going back to Hyrcanus and Aristobulus, which not only was tremendously degrading, but it also gave the Romans an entree into Eretz Yisrael, culminating 130 years later in the Churban Beis Hamikdash. Right, so those are three of the five. I'll mention the other two just very quickly, and I'll actually probably continue with this. We're in the 3 weeks after all. And that is, the fourth one is also very ambiguous. Saraf apustimus es haTorah. Apustimus, burnt the Torah. First of all, who is Apustimus? Don't know who he is. Some say it refers to Pompey, and in various ways. And the second problem is, even if you identify Apustimus, burning a Torah is, of course, a tragedy always. But this is not the only time the Torah was burnt. In the book of Malachim, it records Menashe burned the Sefer Torah. So Torahs have been burnt before. What is so unique about Apustimus burning the Torah that we make a fast day because Apustimus burnt the Torah? So some say the following. Saraf es ha-Torah, he actually burnt the Torah written by Moshe Rabbeinu that was kept in the Kodesh HaKadoshim. Meaning it's not just burnt, as tragic as every burning of the Torah scroll would be, this is the Torah that was burnt. So that was the special thing. And the fifth thing was, and again, we're going to talk more about this, an idol. At some point in the Roman times, there was an idol that was put up in the Beit HaMikdash, and the tradition has it, that was the 17th of Tammuz. Be it as it may, I'm going to leave 4 and 5 for a later time. I'll discuss it next week at more length, because number one, let's try to identify Apustimus, and let's try to identify when an idol was put in the temple, because the most famous incident was Caligula, who was nuts, wanted to put an idol of himself in the temple, and Josephus records there was a mass riot, and the Jews didn't let him do it. So as far as the history goes, there was an attempt to put a tzelem beheichal, but it was not successful. And yet, the Mishnah indicates that a tzelem was put in the heichal. So we'll have to try to discuss what that history is. So for whatever the reason, the Shiva Asar Tammuz events are a bit more shrouded in mystery than the Tisha B'Av events. So again, I'll try to go over this more next week. Have a good